By the end of this video, you will have watched me build the perfect hybrid workbench. Why now? Well, for the last 3 or 4 years, I've made do with this, and this. And yes, that was a ladder. It worked for a while. And when I say hybrid, I mean this table has to have my table saw in it, it has to be an outfeed table, it has to be an assembly table, it has to be sturdy, movable, cleanable, and have storage. It's not much to ask. Oh yeah, and I want it to be the perfect size. By perfect, I mean as big as possible. So those are my wishes, but they are held back by my constraints, which are simple. Space, budget, skill. Space is a really easy one to test. All you need to do, clear your workshop, throw a piece of plywood down on a couple of sawhorses and see if you can still walk around it. If you can, great. If you can't, you're gonna have to go smaller. I'm heading in for a mid-range budget. I've got some leftovers from building the workshop and I'm gonna order in some 2x4s, some CLS timber and some plywood sheeting for the top. On top of that, there's a few accessories that need to go in, but that's pretty much it. We'll talk a bit about skill level as we go. I'm gonna go through it all in this one video from start to finish with no planning. The problem with using cheaper materials, and you might even get this with some of the more expensive, especially if you're going down the box store route, is they're not all perfectly straight. Use the straighter ones for the long pieces and then cut the ones with a curve into the short pieces. And to keep this a complete beginner build, I'm going to be cutting everything with the circular saw, help of a speed square and some straight edges. Hooking it all together? Well, for the frame, that's just going to be using 100mm screws, and then everything else pretty much was covered with 50mm. Build something that's going to suit your purposes for right now and for a little bit in the future. For me, it's the table saw that's the biggest addition to this because I haven't had one before, and that's the future for me. All we're really doing at this stage is framing, basically. And if any of your timbers are a little bit bent when you get to doing the second end of them, easy tip, clip a clamp on, straighten it up manually, stick the second screw in to hold it in place. As I was trying to keep this simple, and really, if you're going to go for legs and you're going to go down a route of half laps or mortise and tenon, that's absolutely fine and will probably be more stable than what I'm doing. But for me, I found it far easier just to put two 2x4s together, make them into a corner piece and then attach that directly to the bottom frame. And you'll see I've got my speed square out here. It doesn't give you a huge reference point for 90 degrees. However, I think for a workbench, you don't need to get this absolutely perfect. I've done a bit of shimming down the line, but to be honest with you, going for absolute perfection is only going to drive you crazy throughout the whole of this build, and it's going to ensure that it takes a lot longer. Right from the beginning, I've been really conscious about the weight of this table. It's going to be a lump, it's going to be a beast, and the table saw is no lightweight piece of equipment. So for the dividers and the shelves, I decided to go down the route of a 1/2 inch ply instead of the probably better for the job 3/4 inch ply, but it was all with weight in mind. Some of the camera angles throughout this entire build are really difficult because you won't see it on the film, but it was absolutely hammering down with rain and I'm working with a bog outside because, well, I spread the mud that I dug out across the entire garden when I made the workshop, which may not prove to be the smartest idea until I actually get grass down. So some of the angles aren't perfect, but I'm going to show you every single bit of the process, and then afterwards, if you guys need more details from watching this, I'm going to write a blog about it. It's going to be on my website with all my other blogs, my tool recommendations, and a step-by-step guide. It's going to take time though, so watch the video and let me know in the comments if there are recommendations or questions that you have, and I'll work my way through them. I'm not breaking any ground here by putting the table saw within the workbench. You can put it at the long end like I have, or you could actually put it sideways into the table. So you've got a much shorter outfeed table, but you have a different angle of usage within your workshop. Now for me, I want it lengthways, I want it at the one end, and a lot of that is based around filming. I'm going to prop it up just with these struts and with some cross pieces out of the same 2x4s that I've been using for everything, and then just a thin sheet of ply on top. Now for this, I've busted out the pocket hole screws, and I wish I'd not used them in this scenario because, to be honest, they didn't do the best of jobs, and I could have just screwed through from the outside with those 100mm screws. Sometimes overthinking a job is probably due in part for me to the lack of planning. I left the stretchers off the top of the table while I was putting the shelf and the table saw in purely because I didn't want them getting in the way while dropping all the other pieces in. It doesn't need to necessarily be perfectly flat at the top because I'm going to show you how I flattened the top down the line. So just get it as close as you can, and you'll see me with this long spirit level. I'm not actually trying to get them flat with the earth. with the bubble. I'm just trying to get them flat with each other to start with as a reference point. For whatever reason, I decided the top pieces joining the stretchers together would work better if they were flat. I don't know why. And then this is where we had to do a little bit of tweaking for the fence. The reason I chose this table saw is because of the rack and pinion fence. In order for the rack and pinion fence to work, you've got to clear out some of the side pieces, and you've got to make sure you go down to the right depth to get that fence to slide nice and evenly through without catching on anything, including the little brackets for taking the fence off itself. Time to bust out some of the more brutal tools that I have in the workshop that just are there to clear out wood. Oh yeah, and to look like a woodworker by tidying it up with a bit of chisel paring. Rough chisel paring. You don't need to spend all your time making this bench look perfect, beautiful, the work of art that is the centerpiece for your workshop. But equally, it is something that, all going well, you're going to use for many years to come. So softening up some of the edges, rounding off some of the corners, giving it a bit of a sand in places that you might not think that is going to be an issue, might just save you a cut, a splinter, or a bit of aggravation down the line. And then I had a brainwave. I figured one side of my bench might take a little bit more abuse than the other. Maybe that's where I do my hand tool work, maybe that's where I hammer things. So I put in a few extra braces. And then another one down the middle to hold the center divide of the workbench. Did I measure any of the tools that I want to put in that workbench? No, I just put it in a random spot somewhere near center. But we did learn an important lesson here. 1/2 inch ply and pocket hole screws don't really go together. I knew this, but I still carried on with it, and that I've decided that this video, due to its length, is going to be the entire construction of the table plus a few of the extras. And then I'm going to finish the internals and I'm going to show you the finished product as it is in a second video where I show you all the accessories that go with the table that I've chosen. Because that way you get to see the entire build and you can have a go for yourself. And then a second video will come out to show you how I've tweaked it to make it more suitable for what I want to use it for. Did I leave a gap in the middle of the table purposefully? No. Will it help with wires and blowing dust out of the table? Yeah. The next bit is what I think is probably one of the most important parts of this, and that's taking what you've got and making it as flat as possible. In all honesty, you can put whatever worktop you want on this. You could go with MDF, you could go with ply, you could go with a laminate worktop of some description. For me, I'm going for 2 sheets of 3/4 inch ply with another layer on top to give me the finish that I want. I want the worktop to actually pull the whole bench together and keep it tight. But if you want the worktop to be flat, you've got to do a little bit of work on the 2x4 frame. The first thing I've done is I've chosen a reference, and that is going to be my long spirit level, and then I'm just pulling it across the tops, and wherever it snags, which was around the pocket holes, I'm just taking a chisel and clearing up any of the waste so it doesn't get trapped between the 2x4 and the ply. And if any of the posts are sticking up a little bit too much, plane them down. So now the posts are your reference point to each other. I found that my table was actually a little bit lower in the middle, and that's really good. But before we go to the next stage, I realised that I actually needed to move this table around while I was working on it. The easiest way to move a table around obviously is having it on casters. But you don't want them to be permanent because the table's moving around underneath you, and also it's some really small pressure points to put onto the floor where the wheels are. Casters that are attached to the side that stay there the whole time. My worry with that in a small workshop is tripping over them. So I spent a bit more on this than I really wanted to, but I don't regret it because these casters come with a bracket that you attach to the leg of the bench, and then you slide the caster in, pin it in, and take it back out. And the biggest selling point's in the manual, heavy. They are for a heavy workbench. You can just lift the workbench from the 4 corners and slide it around to do things, well, like cleaning. Again, before we're flattened, I haven't addressed the height of the workbench. This is something that is going to be so individual to each woodworker out there. So my first build of it is purposefully a couple of inches low. So then what I did was pile a selection of plywood sheets on top, all of different thicknesses, so that then I could get a feel for exactly the height I wanted the bench. Once I was happy, mainly from testing by dangling my arms next to it and seeing what felt comfortable, then I took the plywood pieces that were the right thickness, cut them down to make feet for underneath each of the legs of the table. I made the feet larger than the actual table legs because that again would just spread the weight across the floor a little bit better. And then we played cards. Well, not quite. Then we got to the flattening process. I've seen this done before, it's not my idea. I'm not going for absolute perfection because this is one of those areas you could probably drive yourself completely crazy trying to get it perfect. All I'm doing is taking the spirit level to the high points and then padding out underneath it with as many cards as it takes for it to be nicely tightly wedged under. I'm then sticking them down and going across in every direction and diagonally as well. Again, this is where skill constraint comes into it. I don't believe I've got the skills to get it any further than this, and equally I don't think I've got the skills in building to need anything flatter than this. Once I was happy with it, I screwed the first layer of ply directly to the carcass. And then really you're looking at what is your margin of error. For me, it's 2 playing cards, maybe 1/2 mm in thickness. And then with the plywood sheet on top, because not all plywood sheets are perfect, I just went about testing to see if I could slide it underneath the spirit level at any stage. Once you're happy with it, well then you can work on the second sheet. The second sheet is the same size as the first, plonked it on top and screwed up from the underneath, making sure none of the screws came through out of the top. Put a heavy weight on the middle so it doesn't bow, and start one end and work your way across. You're going to notice at the end of this, by the time the actual final layer of the tabletop is on, that it's going to be seriously difficult to replace because it's screwed down and up and then sealed in place. I do have an idea to combat this, and it is based around the fact that I use multi-layers underneath my legs. If this top gets destroyed by something, over time, I'm going to put another layer of ply on and I will take a layer out of the feet underneath so the bench will stay exactly the same height. Testing it again with the cards, and this time I tested it with a light. I trimmed out the rest in exactly the same manner, checking it was flat. I wanted to have extra pieces next to the side of the table saw as extra support to put things on as well. But here you have to be a little bit careful. As you do with the whole table, I had to ensure that the table saw is raised just above the level of the worktop itself. So when you're sliding plywood boards across it or whatever you're cutting, they're not going to get snagged on the actual outfeed table before coming off the table saw. And that's going to make the job a whole lot safer. I boxed in the table saw as well using offcuts of 1/2 inch plywood, because not only does that create an area that is going to hopefully hold a lot of the dust that this thing creates, it's also going to give me little areas of storage on the outside and make the whole thing look a lot neater. I locked down the table saw just using some offcuts of ply to surround a couple of the legs, and I shimmed it to make sure that it was sturdy and stable. This is something I should have mentioned when putting the table saw in. When you're making the platform for the table saw, err on the low side of caution rather than high, because you can always shim the table saw up. It's really hard to actually bring the level of the workbench top up to make sure that it's at the right height. Oh yeah, and test the fence steel slides just before you fully lock it down. You could leave your bench where it is right now if you're happy with it. Me, I like to have extras on anything that I build. I like to try and push myself, and to be honest with you, that's the fun of the build for me. We talked about the fact that I wanted a full plywood sheet in size and I couldn't have it. So this is my solution. Now 99% of the time, these wings are just going to be attached to the side of the workbench, and I'm going to use them for clamping things too. And they're going to be really handy because I don't actually have a vise on this table, and this is going to be my solution for it. The first wing next to the outfeed table, I haven't worried about countersinking the screws that hold it into place, whereas the one on the full length of the more assembly table side of it, those have been countersunk. And there's a reason for that I'm going to come to later. But these side pieces will actually serve an extension purpose on the table as well, which I'll show you shortly. Now, before I show you the wings, I want to show you what I'm going to cover the table with. And this was a really tough choice because, in all honesty, you could have a plywood tabletop. You could varnish it and most of what you want to achieve will happen on it. As I film on this table, and this is going to be the centerpiece of where I film and talk to you guys, I need to have it a slightly different way to what a normal woodworker would. So the things I need to consider, as I mentioned before, it needs to be hardy. So it has to survive a couple of knife cuts fairly well. Nothing is perfect, but I don't want a Stanley knife going through it in one swipe. Secondly, glue's got to come off easily. The two glues I use, CA glue and wood glue, they've got to come off it in some capacity. And then thirdly, and this is something you guys probably won't need to consider, for me, I can't have any reflections coming up off it, or I want to minimize them anyway. So I got some test pieces from a laminate company, and they sent them through, and I performed the tests on them. There was 2 satins and an ultramat that I ordered, and I have to say the ultramat performed flawlessly on the reflection test. So that's what we went with. I'm no expert with applying this to the wood. All I knew was I had to clean it first, I had to apply contact adhesive to the laminate and the ply, and then when it was dry, put them together. I gave myself a lot of margin. I made sure I'd already cut the pieces a bit big And once they're contacted, I put pressure on with a piece of wood rolled in a towel because I didn't have a roller. This stuff is easy to cut. You just score it 4, maybe 5 times and then snap it. It's far easier than trying to cut all the way through it. I didn't try it with any power tools. The larger area was the one I was the most cautious on because it wasn't one that I could actually easily replace. So I started with the smaller sides and then I got the roller out and I did the whole table. A tip I saw on Scott Walsh's channel, and also I think John from Lincoln Street did it. So that's 2 people, so it's got to be the best way of doing it. When they came to apply the laminate, they put dowels or strips of wood down between the 2 pieces so they could lay them on top of each other, shuffle them to the right position, and then take one piece of wood out at a time, starting with the middle, and gradually flatten the laminate down onto their tables. So that's what I did. I have to say, if you're considering this, it's really not a hard way of putting an extra layer on top of your workbench, and I'm going to do it across a few other areas within my workshop because this stuff is phenomenal. I left it for a little while just to fully cure, and then with a flush trim bit in my trim router, whizzed around the edges and took off all of the excess. Now it does leave a little bit of a sharp edge, and I didn't want to risk catching myself on the edge of the table or cutting myself, so I decided a bit of a hardwood border would be the easiest way to solve that problem. Smaller pieces are just held on with wood glue and a bit of CA glue to act as a clamp while the wood glue's going off. The rest of the longer boards, I did as much tidy up on the hardwood as I could before then attaching it and using blue tape as a clamp. I started with the wings in case I made any mistakes, and then I finished up on the main sides of the workbench. I tried to get the hardwood flush with the top so I didn't have too much sanding to do. I left myself a lip maybe 0.5 mm just so that I didn't leave it low. Oh yeah, and I used some of the offcuts on some of the areas because I didn't have enough to go all the way around. And while the wood glue was curing, I decided I was going to work on the wings. The solution I came up with for making them into wings is really simple. It's just 2 right angle brackets that screw into the same holes that hold the shelf up, and then the shelf is held to them with the same holes that it was held to the workbench with. For the wings, I did flush up the underside of the hardwood so that it didn't snag on the table, but I didn't bother with the main workbench. The main workbench, the top you have to be really careful because even though it's still covered with the plastic sheet that it comes with, the laminate is still in risk of being damaged. And a trick that I like to use is using my finger as a guide that will run across the side of the table, which will stop the card sander actually sanding past the edge of the hardwood. I even got brave with a hand plane for some of the higher spots, and it found that if you do slip and take some of the plastic off the top, you get 1 free swipe. After that, you are damaging the laminate. Now really, you could leave the table and say it's done once again, but there is a big void underneath where the table saw sits, underneath that platform, that is just crying out for a drawer. I am no expert at fitting drawers. All I know is I'm rubbish with a tape measure, so I use a story stick. And the simplest way of describing this is put your 2 hinges in, wedge a stick between the hinges, and that is the width your drawer needs to be. Cut the base to it and then fit the size to that base, and that is a fairly foolproof method of making drawers. I made 2, and I have different hinges on them. So one is a push drawer, one is a pull drawer, one is for all my safety equipment for the table saw, and the bigger one is for other larger objects that go with the table saw. If I can keep my safety equipment close, there's a better chance I'm going to use it. Well, the main takeaways from this are pocket hole screws are fine. Clamp before you screw the pocket hole screws in, keeping them square, and then just screw the base to it. The last of the finishing touches I'm going to show you going in is just the T-track that's going to go on one of the wings. It's a little bit of a taster of what's to come in the next video. Oh yeah, and the big reveal. I'm really proud of the choices I've made for this table. And I know aesthetically a lot of people watching will have zero interest in what a workbench looks like. I totally understand that. Stick a plywood sheet on, when it gets damaged, take it off, stick another one on. It'll work just as well. For me, I wanted to make something that was going to be as versatile as possible and would look good on camera. One extra bit that you gain with making a table in this way, with the 2x4 legs, is a little bit of an alcove on a few of the sides. The one at the front end, which is where I'm going to stand most of the time, has just got a load of sanding pads in it, some notepads, it's got my speed square. They're not deep shelves, but they can be incredibly useful. As for the bigger voids, well, at the moment, one of them is open for dust extraction for the table saw. Another one has got my router table in it. And actually, I do want to show you this. This is something I'm quite excited about. I'm excited about it because I think there's a fair few of you that will be watching this going, where's the power? And bear in mind, this is nothing more than a sneak peek, because I'm quite proud of this. There's a lot of people when I built the workshop that said I should have a plug in the middle of the floor underneath any workbench that I'm going to put in. Well, in a way, you're right. What I do have is a few options. Directly above this workbench, there's 2 double sockets. I believed that they would come in really handy with whatever I was going to use on the workbench. However, I wanted to try a bit of an experiment. And so when Bluetti reached out to me and said, can you test one of our power stations for what you do? I remembered back to my little shed with no electricity, and I thought, actually, there are going to be woodworkers out there who are in sheds like I was with 0 power and who don't want to keep constantly running an extension lead down, and maybe one of these battery power stations would actually work for them. So I decided to incorporate it in my workbench. This is just a sneak peek video. I intend to use this to run the table saw, the dust extraction, and any hand tools, batteries, etc. that I'm going to have within this workbench. The full review of that piece of kit is going to come out in a couple of months' time once I've given it a thorough testing. I hope the video's been useful. I hope you've enjoyed it. And if the second video is already filmed and the accessories are on the table, I'll pop it up here. If not, and you're looking at kitting out your workshop, there are loads of other videos. A great starting point, have a look at that one. Thanks a lot for your time. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you over there.